Welcome to today's webinar, Rethinking Higher Education's Purpose to Include Wellbeing. This is the first event hosted by Learning Well magazine, jointly published by the Mary Christie Institute and the Coalition for Transformational Education. I'm Marjorie Malpiti, the editor of Learning Well magazine and the executive director of the Mary Christie Institute. We're so excited about today's conversation, and we thank you for joining us. I'm going to provide a little bit of context for our conversation, and then we'll get right into it. As everyone probably who has joined us today knows, higher education is experiencing a significant decline in how it is perceived and valued by the public. This decline in public trust coincides with the ongoing mental health crisis among college students. At the same time, we are starting to see more evidence that how people experience college, including having someone who cares about you as a person or finding purpose in what you study, is strongly correlated with flourishing in both life and career. Given all of this, today's conversation asks the question, should well-being be a higher priority for higher education? Should it be a part of its value proposition? And if so, how do we get there? Our panel of thought leaders will examine these questions from their own unique perspectives. And we have saved time for audience questions as well. So please put your questions in the Q&A window. So our panelists have numerous distinctions, but for today, we will just use their first names. Our first panelist is Randy Bass. Randy is Vice President for Strategic Education Initiatives and Professor of English at Georgetown University, where he leads the Designing the Futures Initiative and the Red House Incubator for Curricular Transformation. For 13 years, he was the founding executive director of Georgetown's Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship. And for 7 years, he was Vice Provost for Education. Thank you and welcome, Randy.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. I'm really happy to be here. I think this is such an important topic and been focused on well-being for about 20 years and really happy to be part of this conversation.
And we are so happy you're joining us today. Our next panelist is Jocelyn Johnson. Jocelyn is the Assistant Dean of Student Development and Career Initiatives at the University of Michigan's largest school, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Jocelyn leads the LSA Opportunity Hub and also the Mental Health and Wellbeing Student Advocates Program, where ambassadors work in curricular and co-curricular settings, doing research and making recommendations for environmental improvements for student mental health and well-being. Great stuff. We're so excited that you're here with us today, Jocelyn.
Really excited to be here, especially since we get a chance to center well-being, not just from a deficit perspective, but really thinking about it holistically. So looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Next up is Daniel Porterfield. Dan is the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, a global nonprofit organization whose purpose is to ignite human potential to build understanding and create new possibilities for a better world. Dan has deep experience in higher education, having served as a faculty member and senior vice president also at Georgetown, and then, of course, as president of Franklin and Marshall College. And in June, we will get to read his new book, Mindset Matters, The Power of College to Activate Lifelong Learning. Dan is also on the Learning Well editorial board. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Marjorie. Great to be here. I like what Jocelyn just said about thinking about thriving from a holistic perspective, an asset-based approach. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dan. And finally, we have Dr. Eric Wood. Eric is the Director of Counseling and Mental Health at Texas Christian University. Eric is an award-winning author and creator of the nationally renowned comprehensive care model for college mental health. He is president of the Texas University and College Counseling Directors Association, executive board member of the Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors. Eric is also a member of the Learning Well editorial board. Thank you for being here and welcome, Eric.
As everyone said, I just echo all the comments and I'm very excited to be a part of this. Thank you.
That is great. So I think everybody will get going. As you can see or hear from that incredible the introductions of these incredible panelists. We have a lot to say. They have a lot to impart here. So I'm going to ask Dan, if you'll maybe start us off. I have a two-part question for every panelist, and I'd like you to think about it from each of your unique perspectives. And that is, should higher education include well-being as part of its as part of its purpose and its value? And what would need to change to realize this opportunity? Dan.
So the answer to the first question is easy, yes. And then the second question, what would have to change? Here, I guess I'd like to say that there are a wide array of super promising and even data-supported practices already out there. So it's not as if somehow higher education is totally dropping the ball and not thinking about flourishing and well-being in a holistic sense. So I would say building on what's working, and I'll just say a few things fast to open it up to others to enhance more opportunity for students to have direct access to engaged adults in and out of the classroom, more financial aid so that fewer students have challenges that come down to financing their education, and so that our student bodies reflect the full American mosaic, which is good for all students. Third, more emphasis on holistic learning outside of the classroom and using classroom pedagogies to connect what happens outside the classroom to inside the classroom. There's lots of great work going on, certainly at Georgetown. And then maybe as a fourth thought, we should foreground student agency and challenge students to be the creators of their education, to lead their learning, and to think of their education as their opportunity to define themselves and to have the satisfaction that comes from really designing and delivering your own development.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Dan. I'm going to go back to you later with a couple of other comments and questions, but I want to keep going down the road here. So Randy, I want to ask you the same question. Randy is an aficionado, so to speak, in teaching and learning. And I'd like for you to think about that same question from your perspective. Should higher education include well-being as part of its purpose and value? And I probably should have had a disclaimer that I would bet that all of the panelists would agree wholeheartedly with number one, but I'm asking the question anyway. And secondly, I think most importantly for our audience, what would need to change, in your opinion, to realize this opportunity? What's ahead of us?
Oh, thank you. And I think I do come at this from the perspective of teaching and learning, but I think it'll complement Dan's answer very much. Yes, of course, it should be not just a part, I think, of the purpose of higher education, but in many ways we might think of it as the core purpose of higher education. At least that's really how we should think about it going into the future, because in many ways, well-being enables and enhances all the other purposes of higher education. And so in that sense, I think it really deserves a kind of transcendent place. I wanted to say a little bit about that to kind of put it in perspective. I think of well-being and this conversation about well-being is coming in the middle of kind of a multi-decade arc of change in higher education that maybe started in the mid-90s of a progress toward a learning paradigm, a more student-centered paradigm. And I think that, each decade since the 90s, we've been making progress toward that and learning that a learner-centered paradigm really does involve a lot of the outcomes we associate with well-being, and some of which Dan alluded to, a sense of self-efficacy, a sense of hope, a sense of agency, a growth mindset. I mean, I think these are all things that we really value about education, and we know that well-being can be linked to all of them. So I think of well-being as coming to be a framing term for a lot of other things that have other words. And again, Dan mentioned some of these things like belonging and mattering, culturally responsive pedagogies, even the language of high impact practices. The Gallup data that you allude to, talks about the power of working on a sustained project, which is of course linked to relationships and adult mentorship. Gainful sense of employment. I mean, all of these things are, to me now, what well-being can be a framing term for. So in that sense, well-being should be synonymous with quality pedagogy and high impact education. And I think just to say a word about how we can bring it about, I guess all I'll say right now is that I think it requires a reframing to just think that well-being has to be at the root of everything we do. We can't think of it as an innovation to be implemented. It's not an intervention to be implemented. It's not a set of services. It's really a way of completely refocusing and seeing the entire act of education as having well-being at the root. So that's
Thank you, Randy. That's great. I may circle back with an example or two, because I know you have done a lot of work in this area through Candles and through the Engelhard project there. Maybe just give us a quick overview of the Engelhard project. For me, when I was covering this for Learning Well, that seemed to me to be a remarkable example. And Jocelyn's got another one I'm going to bring up of how to actually integrate well-being centrally into the curricular in a way I haven't really seen before. So maybe for our audience, if they don't already know the Engelhard project, just a little bit of an overview on that.
Sure. So the Engelhard project is named such after Sally Engelhard Pingree, who endowed the project, but it started back in 2005. And it was built on a model of what we call cultural infusion, or curricular infusion, excuse me, where you just look for really the most minimal but meaningful place in any given course where you can introduce an attention to students' interior lives and their well-being in ways that quite organically connect to the academic material. So we would assign faculty to someone from one of our health centers and someone from the Teaching and Learning Center to figure out what a module would look like to connect well-being issues to whatever discipline, from math to business to community engagement to biology to writing. We've had maybe 50 or more disciplines that have been involved with the project, and but it gives at least one opportunity, especially early in students' careers, to have a faculty member say that your interior development is extremely important and it's linked to the actual academic work that we're doing here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Jocelyn, I'm excited to hear more about your work at Michigan. And I know it's interesting because a lot of the issues around well-being people think of as being isolated or different from career. And actually, in your experience, that's not the case at all. Jocelyn works in career development, but also in well-being. So from your perspective, I'll ask you the same question. How do we center well-being, and what needs to change in order to make that happen?
Yeah, for sure. First, I want to say I'm so much in agreement with all of the things that have been coming up, and especially Randy talking about this from a root level. I agree that it's so important to think about it in that way as we think about how can higher education, how can a university setting approach this work. One of the things that comes to mind right away for me is also recognizing that it is a part of the social determinants of health as well. So higher education, the place where students come to learn and gain more information and to expand in what they're thinking, it's a place that they're preparing for life. And so when I think about that in the context of career, but also even more broader than career when it comes to well-being itself, it's so important to recognize that it's not just one component. While I think career is so important, sometimes universities have used that area around purpose as kind of like, that's where we do the bigger picture, like thinking about what is meaningful. And yes, that's a part of it, and it's really important, but it has to be everyone who's playing a part in that work in order to even be able to flourish and do some of that deeper thinking when it comes to what's meaningful. There has to be the ability to actually have the space, right, and the capacity. So that's why I think it's so important for it to be front and center within a higher education environment where there's the entire collective, right, of the university has these different roles that they're playing. So when I think about how can a university do this, I think about it in the same way that there are certain policies, right, that are required when thinking about accreditation, when thinking about how classes are doing grades and coming up with those scales. There should also be ways that universities are thinking about how do they embed well-being and how is wellness being scaled across the board and how is it being assessed as well.
Mm-hmm. Jocelyn, can you tell us a little bit about the Mental Health and Wellbeing Student Advocate Program? Again, this is the first I've seen of something that actually is taking research and then recommendations around environmental policies that impact student mental health, right?
Yes. So the Mental Health and Wellbeing Student Advocate Program is within the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan. It is 2 individuals that do that work. Janelle Zora and Brandon Bond are the mental health and wellbeing advocates. And it's taking a public health approach in particular. So it's looking at things upstream. So rather than waiting to look at crisis, which we know that work is so important, and we have wonderful partners that are doing that work as well. This program is interested in looking at things systemically. So looking across the college and seeing what ways may we be helping or potentially hindering mental health and well-being of students. And from there, the advocates are assessing through first conversations, focus groups with faculty, staff, and students to learn about what's happening, to be able to make recommendations and to make policy level change as well. And just also bringing to the forefront what are some potential missing gaps so that we can do what we can to be preventative or to do something early on. But even broader than that is finding ways to embed well-being into the college for it to be at the forefront from the beginning. So that's the program in a snapshot.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask Eric now to talk a little bit about his program at TCU, but again, within the context of thinking about well-being as a higher priority. Eric, you and your staff see and serve students directly around their mental health, and you have more than anyone I've actually covered, really taken that phrase to heart. You can't hire ourselves out of this problem. We have to be thinking differently about partnerships, et cetera. You really are taking a full campus approach to student mental health. And I'd like you to just, when you answer the question, talk a little bit about what you're doing there, because it's really innovative.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, first of all, to answer the question, yes. And as all the panelists said, in fact, I've been contending for years at College of Mental Health, we really are a premier healthcare system in the world. I really think that schools and universities, we have the best in the world in terms of mental health care at doing what we were designed to do. In fact, no other healthcare system has the potential impact that we have. And the reason why I say that is to understand like how you realize the opportunity. There's 2 things. First of all, people need to understand that there is a systematic gap between what college and counseling centers were designed to do and then the changing dynamics on our campuses. The way I think about this like a tier system. So you have like tier 1 are the students with really high mental health needs, chronic and severe. And what we know about that tier is that it's growing at a time. Like 50 years ago, if you had bipolar disorder, you probably didn't go to college, but now it's just commonplace. So we know that tier is just growing. Then the second tier, the way I think about our students who are in a mental health crisis. They're just something acute, really emerging, but in crisis right now. And then the third tier is the students who have normative and developmental concerns that come to counseling center. And we need to remember that that tier is the majority of our students, despite all the narrative that's out there. The majority of our students come to counseling center because of normative and developmental concerns. And then the 4th tier is the students who come to the counseling center, but they really have subclinical needs. They really don't need a licensed therapist, but they come because there's just a visual on campus. And so what counseling centers were designed to do, we were actually designed to do tier 3, which is the normative and developmental concern. That was why we were kind of developed and established because in developmental lifespan, starting college and ending college, that's the time where literally everything in your life can change. So we define stress as change, and then the associated stressors like school, and then the preventative because they do high-risk behaviors, and then you have emerging. That's why college counseling centers exist, is for tier 3. And then we realize that we're actually the best in the world at doing tier 2, which is crisis response. Because of our location, because of our access, no one else can respond to a student crisis better than what we could. But the problem is again, Tier 1 is exploding with all these students who come on campus with high mental health needs. And then Tier 4 is also growing, which isn't bad, but counseling is more mainstream. And so a lot of times what counseling centers struggle with is that we try to absorb, and this is what we call the absorption model, where we try to absorb all the students in Tier 1 and then all the students in Tier 4, and we just don't have the capacity for that. So we're juggling all these things and we end up dropping the ball. And if you drop the ball in Tier 1, which is students with high mental health needs, that's dangerous. And if you drop everything, then people start doubting the competency of the counseling center. And so what's needed, in my opinion, is to replace the absorption model is what we call the collaborative model. And that's kind of what we've done at TC. We're doing this for 4 years. I've actually helped other schools do it. And so at TC, to answer your question, Mark, what we do is my staff, we split it. Part of my staff, we focus on Tier 3, the students with the normative and development. So my staff, that's their job, is to focus on that. They have scheduled sessions with students who are coming with normative and developmental concerns. Then we actually realign some of my staff where we actually have dedicated triage and crisis response counselors. So some of my counselors literally come to the counseling center and they just wait for students to come in either in triage and crisis. So we focus on Tier 2 and Tier 3, and we contend that we are literally the best in the world at doing that. So then the question is, well, what do you do about students in Tier 1, the high mental health needs? We decided just to collaborate. And when we collaborate, we use the resources that are already there. Like we have the conference center, we have the infrastructure, we have the IET, we have access to students, but we don't have the programs. But there's treatment centers all around who have the programs that are specifically designed for students with high mental health needs, but they don't have the access to the services, the prime location, the infrastructure that we have. So we just merge them together. And so we literally have treatment centers come to campus, they use our infrastructure, we get their program, and yeah, tuition doesn't cover it, but insurance covers it, and we just fundraise for the cost of the copay. And what we realize is that covering the copay is a lot less expensive than hiring a bunch of new therapists or building a new building. And at this point, 4 years into it, we haven't spent any money on the copay because we were fundraising. We got a couple of federal grants, we got donations, we've had local grants. And so we were able to raise the money, no cost to the student, and it hasn't cost our university any money. So that's how we do Tier 1. And then Tier 4 with the subclinical needs, we partner with campus partners. We literally say that we're collaborating with all of our campus partners in terms of mental health and well-being. So our student activities, we partner with them with homesickness, our student success with time management, procrastination. We can go on and on about like how we need those partnerships. We always say that college mental health isn't a clinical issue, it's a community issue. And that community involves campus, on-campus partners, and off-campus partners. So that's my elevator speech really quick.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. I never tire of hearing it, and hopefully people here will agree. There's so much to unpack there and learn from what Eric's doing. So that's actually a really good segue into a question I'm going to go back to Dan on. And Dan, I may be putting you on the spot here, but I know you're good at that, responding to that. You started out talking about all the good things that are happening. And I think that having just heard from you and your panelists, you can see that that is true. So my question to you is really more about this perception of higher ed and the perceived value of higher ed and all of the op-eds we've all read about that. Why do you think that the public isn't getting this kind of perception? I know a lot has to do with affordability and access, and we have to tackle that very difficult issue. But you and I had a conversation about maybe the narrative on this is not quite right. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes. So I do think that the challenges of affordability color everything because higher education across the board struggles with the answer to that question. We then struggle to hold trust in other areas, I think. But many of the people that are criticizing higher ed, and let's face it, it's coming from multiple quarters. For some, the critique is that higher education has become so elite that it's out of touch with everyday people's needs and students' hopes for careers and jobs that can help them. For others, it's almost the opposite argument, that higher education effectively just preserves the status quo and keeps people away from opportunity. And for some, it's that it's like a waste of time and it's impractical. And for some, it's that it's like left-wing indoctrination. So you have all these different critiques coming together. And I think that it is very hard for at least for presidents in the academy to go on offense because they are constantly subjected to another critique. And so it's important for other voices to step forward. Employers, parents, people like me who lead nonprofit institutions, scholars who study learning outcomes, and to try to show where higher education is making a disproportionate difference for students. And I'm going to, for the moment, talk about traditional students. I realize there are some schools that have signed on for this that are working with part-time students or mature students. But if, in the narrative of the 18 to 23-year-old college goer, there is no better system in this country for facilitating growth, the emergence of self-confidence, self-awareness, a connection of self and other, the beginnings of feelings of efficacy in work and in creativity, and the adoption of mindsets that one is a learner or a creator or a collaborator. There's no better setting that we have than the residential college to facilitate that kind of development. But somebody has to be an advocate for it. That's point one. The second point is that we're not perfect. And so we have to create the story we want to be the story, which is one of the themes I hear in the other panelists. They're doing things that really build on strength and make their institutions that much more valuable. And so it can't be just that we make our narratives about the value of higher education, look, we're good, you don't appreciate us. But it also should be that we're always trying to be on the leading edge to create value for students and society. And we're innovating to do that. And listening to the three other speakers, and I know Randy well because he influenced my way of teaching. There are change makers and innovators all across higher education who are doing exactly what these three panelists are doing. And I think it's in our collective interest to focus some of the narratives on what they are building from and to, so that we look like we're living for the future and not just defending the past. But I also don't think we should be so defensive about what we do that we can't actually come out and say, we believe in this.
Right. Thank you for that.
But it's very hard for presidents to do this because they come out and speak and they immediately get attacked from multiple quarters. And so I really believe we need more voices, including, by the way, students themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, Dan. Any other panelists have a comment on what Dan just said? Changing the narrative. One of the things I wanted to do, and again, jump in at any point if you have a comment on that, is that is a really burning issue, particularly right now in higher education. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit and ask a couple of different questions now that I have you here. One of the themes of Learning Well magazine is looking at the burning issues in higher education from a perspective of well-being, both on campus and throughout one's lifetime. And then that includes everything, as Jocelyn said, the social determinants of well-being, mental health, etc. So I wanted to ask about some of those issues from a well-being lens. And by the way, sort of picking up on what Dan was saying, we are going to do, in Learning Well, we're going to do a series on conflict on campus, where we asked experts and students to consider how the war in the Middle East and the protests around that, the identity politics, how that's impacting their own well-being, that of the communities, and more importantly, what are the experts helping us think through in terms of how to heal that. So my first question is to Eric. And this is about an issue that, again, is in the higher ed press constantly and is extremely important. So you're at TCU, your state and others have passed legislation eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. How does this controversial issue look from a mental health and well-being perspective?
Yes, I think just to kind of piggyback with Dan to imply the narrative, I think that's the first part, because a lot of these laws are being passed with a missed narrative about identity. the assumption that like students already have the identity, and these laws are just about excluding and excluding students or hiring practice. But what's missing in the narrative is that college experience actually shapes identity. That's just like a fact, and that's in the literature, and we know that. And so if you kind of prohibit DEI like activities or multicultural experiences, then you're actually limiting or restricting the experiences that students have to actually develop their identity. And so that's, I think, a key part of the narrative that's just missing. And I think people just talk about identity as it's done, but it's not. So part of that conversation is to include that higher education, we do shape identity. And so that's really important. But in terms of kind of mental health, especially our things, I mean, there's pragmatic things, like, for example, the laws are confusing and they contradict. So like, for example, in Texas, or Senate Bill 17, that says, you know, you have to get rid of DEI, but only that, I'm not on top of that. Like, if you work for a state school and the school requires you to do DEI, multicultural counseling, then that employee, like, I could sue the school. Like, the government says I could sue the school because they cannot make me take multicultural counseling. And I can actually cite Senate Bill 17. But at the same time, the government is requiring me to keep my license to take 6 hours of multicultural training every 2 years as part of my CEUs. So that really doesn't make sense. There's also in Texas contradicting in the laws. Like, we have Senate Bill 17, but we also have House Bill 906. And House Bill 906 says that schools have to provide education about our suicide prevention plans. We have to be able to make that readily available. And then it says in that law that we have to describe appropriate interventions. Well, in the literature, appropriate interventions is broken down to empirically validated interventions and culturally competent interventions. So if that is the appropriate intervention that we have to talk about in House Bill 906, then doesn't that contradict what Senate Bill 17 is? And so that is also a contradiction. But the scary thing about that is that now we have some schools who don't know how to interpret that contradiction. And so they're actually planning to eliminate the cultural-based outreach for suicide prevention, which the impact of that could be, you know, dangerous. And we don't think that's what the legislator wanted or intended to do. And so there is that contradiction. Then, yeah, I mean, in Texas, the original Senate Bill 17 had the exemption for healthcare providers because they knew we need to be able to do this. And somehow that exemption was removed. And so we don't know. I will say this, we're still talking about it. This is not over. I mean, the bill did get passed. It's going to take place January 1st. But we do have a couple of centers. We have meetings planned this week to talk about these contradictions and it's confusion with mental health. And that's just the pragmatic thing. I mean, there's also the ideal like belonging that came up. We know belonging is a buffer for pretty much everything. If you have a sense of belonging, it's a pretty much buffer for every mental health factor. So you want to foster that belonging, and that includes the identity. So if schools feels like they're handicapped in doing that, then what are the ramifications of that? We also know that there's an increased globalization in the world, and a lot of employers in terms of post-graduation want students to be skilled in diverse cultures. And so why are we handcuffed that? So there's things like that. And also, what do the students want? So, I mean, these laws were passed by a handful of politicians, even in Texas. It wasn't an overwhelming vote in the Senate, but what we don't know is what the students said, you know, and we do know when we poll the students, these laws are unpopular. So you actually take the student voice out of the process. So there are things like that, but generally our response is the misnarrative about what identity is in the process of development, and it's just confusing us and it's handcuffing us, so.
Wow, there's a lot there. And to learn a little bit more about Eric's opinion on this, and I think it's important too, because you're the head of the Counseling Center Association there. So I know when we talked, you said there was a lot of confusion and concern. Eric just wrote a really good piece for us in Learning Well that's in our perspective section. So appreciate that. It's more to come.
Margaret, if I could just compliment something that Eric said.
Yep.
In the book that I just finished, I have a chapter where I talk about how colleges can help students to thrive by understanding both the enduring values that they bring to their education from their community life, their family, their upbringing, and some of the emergent values that they may start to form because they're exposed to new opportunities. And I talk about 3 students named Carolina, Nadia, and Jeanette, each of whom are from underrepresented communities and went to Franklin and Marshall College. And they faced particular challenges that for them, the answer to moving forward, which did include counseling, heavily involved drawing upon values sort of deep as the river that they grew up with in Black and Latino communities. And that a very skilled faculty and counselors were able to help them in moments of crisis to understand these core values that were the motivating factor in their education, in their choosing all the sacrifices over all the years to go to college. Right. And in each of those cases, their self-knowledge and their knowledge of identity deepened, and the deepening then helped them meet the challenges that were right in front of them. And in some cases, that came from caring faculty, and from some it came from therapists. But that idea that our upbringing and our identities are an asset to help us navigate the challenges and pursue the opportunities of college does require faculty and counseling staffs and other mentors who are culturally sensitive and can help students locate in their lived experience the assets that can help them overcome difficulties and pursue great opportunities. And so to sort of forbid colleges from tapping those assets is really completely counter to the overall aims of education.
Thank you for adding that, Dan. I might ask Jocelyn a related question. We had talked about the work that you do aligning purpose, identity, purpose, and belonging into career planning. And I think it's terrific, and we're seeing a lot of work emerging in that area. There's some criticism of this that thinking about those kinds of things are a luxury for some and not for others, and it becomes a bit of an equity issue. What do you think about that, and how does that play out for you at Michigan?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question, and one that also connects to me to changing the narrative, because I think in this case, the word luxury can actually serve as a mask to a degree, instead of looking at flipping it around and looking at the system. Why is it a privilege that some get to experience thinking about purpose and well-being? And we see that the research says that individuals who do have this sense of connection to purpose have a greater sense of flourishing, right, within the environment, and then the same for post-graduation. So what does it mean to then say, okay, what systems do we have in place that may be hindering students from being able to actually take the time to do some of that work? I think is the deeper question in this case. And so that's where these other things come into play when we think about like Maslow's hierarchy, right? It's some of those basic needs, and we look across the different 8 dimensions. So we look at financial well-being. In what ways are maybe some students just trying to keep their heads above water, right? And so they haven't been able to spend more time in this space. And if we're centering well-being, right, within a higher ed environment, how does that fit into the big picture? Like, how do we think about that work? So I would say, yes, it's something that is disproportionate, but I would say we're focusing on it in the wrong way. It shouldn't be a luxury. It should be a birthright to be able to think about one sense of meaning, what's important to them. And so in what ways do certain groups or communities have privilege? And why do other groups not have that same privilege? And then approaching that work from that angle, I think, is like the work of a higher ed environment. And so when thinking about that, and I'll speak to the career space, because I'm guessing I probably have some career colleagues that are on here too, where we do like to make that space through like coaching appointments to think more deeply about some of those pieces. But then we also know we need the collective of the community. We need this to show up in all of the different areas. And so I love that you brought this question even here, because I think there's people from all different areas. And how do we think about this within career, but how do we also think about these other systems across the student life cycle that are impacting well-being that prevents maybe some students from being able to have that same level of thinking about that in that depth, because we know it's so important and how it does connect to even post-graduation and what the trajectory looks like. So it has long implications.
That's great. Thank you for that. So Randy, I want to, maybe this might be the last question, right? I'm looking at my assistant here, Adeo Rodriguez, and Deo is saying that we have time for one last question. I wanted to ask you, Randy, a little bit, again, sort of jumping off of what Jocelyn was just saying, which was, I think, really, really important, is a lot of this, higher ed is often very siloed. A lot of this has to do with the fusion of sort of everything that's going on campus, right? And particularly inside the classroom. Someone recently said the classroom is the new frontier for student well-being. And I know you've done a lot of this work over the years, but not all classrooms are set up to have this kind of dynamic unfold. So what needs to change around that?
Thank you. And let me maybe try to connect that also to Jocelyn and several of the previous, comments, that I think, one place that one has to begin is to just ask the question, what kind of education does every student deserve? And if you really begin there, then the classroom has to be seen as really central. I don't know if it's the new frontier or if we're just seeing it as a critical space where what Dan said about that convergence of the values that students bring with them and the emerging values they get from having their horizons expanded. The classroom should be like one of the most important sites where that dynamic is getting reproduced. It's not the only one, but it's critical. And even back when we started the Engelhardt project, we used to think that about the connection that was going on in the classroom as a way of reconnecting a broken circuit. That you can do everything you want out in the environment and all kinds of support services. If something isn't happening in the classroom, then that electrical circuit is broken and nothing is flowing. So I think if we're talking about a transformative education that every student deserves, the classroom has to be really central in it. And, I always think about Bell Hooks's, amazing line that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. So if we're talking about reproducing well-being as part of the central paradigm, has to be in the classroom, along with the other kinds of things we're talking about. And I agree with Jocelyn that that's also the great leveling space, in the sense of that all students are passing through classrooms. Now, do all courses lend itself to it? I think it depends what the it is in that sentence. There isn't a single course that we teach that can't humanize itself, that can't think about the ways that students are seen, the way their dignity is seen, the way their voices show up. It doesn't matter what the topic is or the scale. There are things that you can do. There are certainly classes that lend themselves more to a certain kind of reflection and engagement with individual well-being. And I think that if just a larger majority of classes paid more attention to it, then it wouldn't matter if all classes do the exact same thing. I think it's really about just shifting the center of gravity so that we're equipping students with repeated experiences of being able to bring their whole selves into the classroom, faculty bringing themselves in the classroom, and that some of this merging of their values and their development is just made space for. So I think the way you need to do it is, one is you can accelerate it by naming it. And I think giving this attention to well-being is critical. I think a lot has happened in the last several years by naming culturally inclusive pedagogies, by linking it to campus climate, by connecting faculty professional development to the data on campus climate. I just think we have to continue to add those layers to include well-being and to make well-being visible. I think the other two things that we need to think about around that is, one, is engaging students' agency. Dan said this way back at the very beginning: the more that you give students control over their education, the more that you're also serving well-being. And then the other piece I want to just name, and I won't say anything more about it, is staff, especially academic staff. they're often the people on campus who bear the brunt of trying to provide well-being for students. And they're usually the last cohort that's thought about by the institution on how to take care of their well-being. But I think being able to connect the co-curricular and academic staff to the academic enterprise is also a way to buffet or buffer the classroom as a critical space of reproducing a certain kind of relationship that's essential to well-being.
Great points. Thank you so much. We are going to shift to the audience now and allow everyone to be able to ask you all questions. And to do so, I am going to introduce my colleague, Dana Humphrey, who is the managing editor of Learning Well and the associate director of the Mary Christie Institute. Dana, are you?
Hello, I'm
jumping
here.
on now? Hello. Hi, Dana.
Hi, everyone. This has been such an interesting conversation so far, and we have an active chat, so I will get right to it. The first question might be best to start with Randy and Jocelyn, and maybe follow up with Dan. What are some of the practical changes being made to policies and procedures that restrict choice and well-being? Would you advocate tangible changes such as eliminating the following: grading, academic dismissal, majors, minors, semesters, holds on registrations, course choice preference for upper class students? So it's really on the academic side.
I'm wondering, Jocelyn, if you've heard anything similar from your ambassadors.
Yeah, so I'll start, and a little bit more context is that the Ambassador with the Advocate program is a 3-year pilot that then will fold out into something larger based on the recommendations that are made. So currently they are in the assessing process, so they have not actually made the changes to the different policies just yet. But I can speak to some things that I know that are already happening on campus. One is around probation. In particular, working to change the language around that so that it's not so much seen as in a punitive way. It's like some of those early conversations through letters. What does that look like? More of a partnership, whereas in the past, the language looked different. And then rather than like a dismissal, like the next step, more of an extended period so that there's still this ability to come back if things are needed. So that's one thing where previously it was less of a retention, I guess, lens of saying like, okay, how can we work together? And before it was more of a warning of where you were. So that's one area that's being pivoted. And then another area where there's been a focus on campus at large and then also within the college is related to standardized testing, more so at the graduate level. And is it really even a true measure? And in many cases, that becoming optional is another policy change that's taking place.
That's great. A follow-up with Eric in terms of practical changes, and I know you have something to say on this. Another audience member asked about the role of peer support programs in fostering well-being.
Yeah, so we're really big on peer support. In fact, it started off just kind of our mentality that a lot of, especially in mental health, a lot of counseling centers, the temptation is just to stop when the symptoms are in remission because you need the slot. But if you look at other fields like substance use, clinical is actually just a phase. And so after you go through the counseling phase is the ideal of you need peer support, you need to live a life of recovery. So using that as an aftercare, and that's basically what we've done. And so we use that not just for substance use, but pretty much all the mental health domains that you can think of, and even some that aren't mental health domains like gaming. And one of the things that we have found out is that the students who are active in the peer support, they're less likely to return to counseling. So it has been a capacity issue for us as well in terms of helping building our capacity. But that is one thing we're very much huge on. We have a learning network with peer support communities where you host webinars. That is one thing we're known for. And yeah, students can say things to other students at times during the day or even at night that other staff just can't say. So big support on that.
Great, thank you. This one is a great question for everyone on the panel. Maybe we'll start with Randy. What would you say are the top 3 high impact changes that can be made in higher ed to increase student well-being?
So I would say one would be greater diversification of grading practices. I'm not going to go all the way to ungrading or, because I think it's all highly contextual, but I think looking really hard at the relationship between grading practices and all the things that we've talked about. I think in finding ways in the curriculum to engage students as partners in aspects of the curriculum where students are helping to design for other students. And that, I guess, links to the other peer leadership. And then I think it's really continuing to develop more experiential, project-based, purpose-based educational contexts where faculty and students are having the experience of working together on problems. Again, not all courses can be made that way, but if an increased percentage of each student's journey had these more collaborative spaces in which faculty, students, practitioners, staff were working on meaningful problems, which to me needs to become the center of education, I think that you'll just create an environment in which students are developing a much greater sense of self-efficacy and a sense of themselves as not just floating through the educational enterprise, but actually having some control over it.
Does anyone have a follow-up there?
Well, I would compliment robust financial aid. I think that is one of the structural preconditions, if you will. And then Franklin and Marshall had a phenomenal college house system, which made the residential community a real living learning community. There's all kinds of great things to say about it, and I'll pause on describing it further, but it was incredibly exciting to see that come to bear. Certainly destigmatizing all aspects of mental wellness is critical. Maybe that's happened to some extent, but I also would want to answer it in relation to the earlier question that Joshua asked. And Randy had a version of this in his answer. I write about 4 students from very different backgrounds who developed a fierce passion for learning at Franklin and Marshall. And their names were Morgan, Eddie, Charisma, and Wyatt, and very different backgrounds. And having active learning experiences early in their education. And then for these students, the invitation right in front of them to go deeper and to get involved in research with faculty members. For those students, that was absolutely igniting. But if you told their stories a different way, in each of the 4 students' cases, there also was a moment of unhappiness and a moment of where they were working on something within themselves. And so the combination of having support for their own emotional and social needs and having present academic opportunity right in front of them, those two together in these 4 stories really made a huge difference. And now these 4 young adults are off living their best lives.
I love that story. And something that is related that I think is a really good question, and I'll start with you, Dan. This audience member says, our students are working hard in classes, jobs, and even maintaining 2 jobs just to make it financially. Our students are so busy that sometimes the joy of living is missed or it is secondary. The joy of learning, joy of playing, joy of enjoyment. How do we help our students enjoy this ride of life?
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think that is one place where having lots of educators of all types, staff and faculty educators, prominent and present in the community is a big help. We lived in a dorm at Georgetown, my family and I, for 8 years before I went to Franklin and Marshall College. And I was convinced that just having a family with 3 kids and a dog wandering around present all the time was an invitation for students to remember something that they really value that they didn't see as much, which was family life and kids. And so how can we make sure that with all the practical industry and busyness of college life, we also create space for relationships? And relationships can take all forms. Everybody on campus is an educator and a potential mentor and friend to students.
Thank you. Jocelyn, I might follow up with you here. Do you see anything in your work with the ambassadors to, obviously they're adding something onto their plate in terms of helping students access joy more?
Yeah, I love that question. One of the things that's important for the advocates is actually spending time listening and learning from the students about what's most important. And I think that one of the areas that's key is also that peer support as being a big piece of the puzzle as well, and finding more ways and more of those informal learning spaces with one another where they feel like they have a sense of safety and community, to prioritize that as a part of their sense of belonging, and really also kind of deriving joy from those spaces being important as well.
That's great. All right, we have 3 minutes left, and I am trying to choose between a bunch of different questions. I think we just have one left. And I think it would be nice to end on a positive note. And Dan, I know you have something to say about that. How do you imagine engaging student agency as it relates to well-being, and how is that implemented? This audience member said, since the pandemic, I've seen that students have much less agency, and I'd love to hear how to help them now take more ownership of their education.
I think everybody on this panel has good answers to that, and there's a lot of approaches, but I think that each educator should assign themselves the responsibility to get to know students and to help draw out from them the greatness that's inside of them, what it is that animates them and motivates them, makes them feel that they are growing into the person they hope to be. And so I think that's first and foremost. Each of us can make a difference in that way. From an organizational perspective, I would love to see more ways of helping students document their learning besides the transcript, so that they could see the growth they are enacting in a record that is more than just grades in classes. And probably some on this panel have thought about that more deeply, but another kind of way of seeing one's own growth to motivate further proactive work to grow in direction students want.
Eric, I think I'll follow up. Oh,
Sorry. I just wanted to jump in there because I wanted to also, in the last minute we have, we could go on and on with this great conversation. I wondered if Dr. Wood had anything to say about that in terms of student agency, because you do so much work in that area, and I know you see sort of the amazing stuff that goes on between peers.
I think bigger picture is just the narrative about mental health, and actually about the counseling center too. Just in terms of, because so many conflicting messages, like some people think it's a weakness to ask for help, and the narrative of no, it actually means that you care for something if you care enough about to ask for help. And that, college, campuses, there's so many gatekeepers. People don't think about that, how many former clients are actually on campus right now to be served as potential gatekeepers. So you're not the only one. So just in terms of the agency, I think putting some stock into what the narrative is on mental health, and as is a value added, I would definitely say that's definitely where something schools can do more.
Thank you. Sorry, Dana. I was going to just have you manage that, but you knew I was going to sneak something in.
The floor is yours, Marge.
No, actually, I think that is the last question and all the time we have. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists, Randy and Jocelyn and Eric and Dan. And I would encourage everyone to keep thinking about rethinking higher education's purpose. And I'd like to thank all of the audience who spent the last hour with us to really look at these really important questions. And from Learning Well magazine, I'd like to say, please read us, learningwellmag.org. It's a free publication, and we'd love to hear from you as well. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today.